Hi there. My name is Lauren C. Klein. I teach 6th grade science and social studies at Jefferson Island Road Elementary School in Louisiana, Iberia Parish, outside of New Iberia. And today's screencast is going to be on developing social studies assessment tasks, and in particular, using primary sources in the classroom. This screencast is based on a professional development session I am doing in conjunction with the other screencasts that I have on developing inquiry-based science tasks. Both of these were presented at professional development for science and social studies teachers in my school district who teach 3rd through 6th grade science and social studies. Today's objectives for our screencast is this. First off, you will be able to understand the need for rigorous primary source-based activities. You will be able to explain the connection between primary source-based activities and social studies tasks on state assessments. You will be able to create a systematic method of practicing historical analysis skills using primary sources, and you'll be able to identify some collections of primary sources, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this session. Now, so why are we all here? Why are we looking at this? Well, as I said in my science screencast, this previous year, our scores in 3rd through 6th grade science and social studies dropped. And statewide test scores in the state of Louisiana in science and social studies either flatlined or to a small extent dropped. So we're going to look at social studies through the same light that I'm doing in my session on science. Now, I do a whole lot of student surveys both before and at the end of the school year, kind of to gauge my students' interests and also what they think of the topics and kind of what their concepts about learning and things are, to where I can tailor my instruction for them. And this is one of my students' responses whenever I taught middle school social studies. This is an honor student, mind you, because I was teaching honor social studies. He said, social studies is so boring. All I do is memorize facts to take the test, and then I forget about them once that we're done. And that kind of highlights the point that social studies is a tricky subject to teach. The way the standards, especially in the state of Louisiana, our grade level expectations force us to teach, it devolves the subject into a pile of facts that are to be memorized and not connected to each other. No one likes that. Everybody hates history because it just becomes flashcards. So what ends up happening is you have a class full of people who are just like this all day long, because it's nothing but dead people and facts and things that they did, and you're just tired of hearing about it. In the same subject, that I taught, honor 7th grade history, this was a response from the end of the year, that they said that they found the ILEAP test very easy. They remembered what the question was about, and they always knew the answer. However, when they had to write the essay for constructed response, it was really hard because finding things when I had to read the information was impossible, which really makes things difficult for students because of the way assessments are made in the state of Louisiana. This quote also talks about the dichotomy with the way students in Louisiana are tested on ILEAP and LEAP. Most of the GLEs, the grade level expectations, the individual statements that tell teachers what they're supposed to teach the students, for the vast majority of which, for social studies, are actually very lower order thinking. You have a whole lot of identify and explain. Identify and explain are the Bloom's words that work with them. And you have these historical thinking GLEs, of which, as you go up in the grades, it gets to about 10 of them, where you have things like analyze and evaluate and things like that. But out of the 40 or so GLEs, these only make up about 10% of what you're supposed to be teaching. However, this 10% of GLEs are kind of the most important ones whenever we talk about what it's like to be a historian and stuff, because it's what historians do. And that's where you see this dichotomy in this quote, where most of the test is straight up lower order thinking. A good student can memorize the information, just kind of remember, oh, well, this is an important person, answer it correctly. When they have to read a primary source and then write about it, it all falls apart because instruction is so focused on mastering these GLEs. And the state of Louisiana, in speaking with someone in the assessment department, gave me this little tidbit of information. As you can see, less than 5% of students in grades 3 through 11 statewide that is taking ILEAP or LEAP in grades 3 through 8 and U.S. History end-of-year course, they were given the social studies assessment, and they had to complete constructed response writing. And we'll talk about how they're graded later on in this screencast. but less than 5% of students scored a 3 or a 4, which is the two highest scores you can make on their assessment task. So as you can see in purple is everybody in the state of Louisiana scores who scored below a 3 or a 4, and the yellow is the 3 or 4. Whereas on a similar scale for the multiple choice component, you have about 20 to 25% scoring the equivalent of a 3 or a 4, which is scoring 75% or greater correct on the test, which is the scores for mastery and advance. And so that really puts it into account. And when I was talking with the person from the state wouldn't give any more aggregated total than that, but what they were able to tell me is that the vast majority of students were scoring below a 2, which is the equivalent of basic or basic competency. So we have a really big problem in Louisiana with this. If so many students aren't doing well on this, we have to adjust our teaching to it. And we can talk about grade level expectations being very dichotomous in terms of the high-low mixture and the form of the assessment and things like that. But in all reality, there's not much we can do about it. We can just prepare our students the best we can. And the best way we can do it is through primary source instruction. So I know looking at these scores, you're like, whew, that's not good, and we should be probably going on from there. So let's look at the social studies task the way it is in the state of Louisiana. And if you're watching this from another state, your assessments, usually with primary sources, is broadly similar. So let's look at this. And like I said, that this is for 3rd through 6th grade in my school district. So if you're watching from outside, there you go. 3rd grade iLeap, 11% of the test score, total score, is consisting of constructed response scores. There's 36 points total. And 4 points consists of constructed response. They read a primary source, read a source of some sort, they answer 2 multiple choice questions, and they answer 1 extended response question. This is really the introductory assessment. 4th grade is considered a benchmark. It's LEAP. 24% of the test consists of constructed response. 16 out of the 66 points available on LEAP in social studies comes from constructed response. They have to read some sources. They answer 2 short answer constructed response questions worth 8 points total. Then they answer 4 multiple choice questions and an extended response question to another set of sources, usually 2 sources to go. 5th and 6th grade are very similar. 17% of the test, so that is 8 of the 48 possible points with 4 multiple choice questions and 1 extended response. Like I said, 6th grade is the same, but you do have a change in what students have to write about in 6th grade. Whereas before in 3rd, 4th, and 5th, they just have to write about the sources and kind of answer it. In 6th grade, students have to make a claim and take evidence from the primary sources. By this time in 6th grade, you have 4 sources. They have to use information from those 4 sources to back up their claims. And this goes on forward into 7th and 8th grade. And that's as of this year, the 2015 edition of iLeap. Now, for the 2015-16 school year, the state of Louisiana is doing a field test. And as the time of this recording, which is in late July 2015, the state has not released any information about the field test. They will be doing so in August. And so while the exact way that students are being assessed will change in terms of what the test is going to consist of, the skills that we're about to talk about will stay the same. And the grading rubric, though, we're not sure of, but we will find out when it's released in August. So please keep that in mind whenever we're moving forward. So how are these social studies tasks scored? Well, back in 2010, I took training to be a grader for LEAP constructed response for science and social studies. As of right now, like I just said, the formula hasn't changed for social studies. So I'm going to give you some insights based on how these essays were graded when I spent 2 days with a bunch of angry retired teachers. And we had to grade these things and stuff like that. And just listening to the retired teachers complaining about responses and stuff like that really gave me some insight about how student responses are graded. So let's look at them. If a student writes their essay and turns in a score and it's graded a 0, this is what the rubric. In order to get a 0, this is what a student response has to have. It either leaves the answer space completely blank, like they don't answer anything at all, or writes about something that has absolutely nothing to do with the prompt or supporting materials. In other words, If you're talking about the Roman Empire and they start talking about the Empire from Star Wars, they're getting a 0. And bless, we know and we love our students, but in order to get a score of a 0, you kind of have to be like this. It's the student in class where no matter what you do, you give the instructions, they never follow them because whatever reason. If they turn in something like that, they're going to get a score on the 0. They're going to get a score of 0 on their constructed response. Now, the majority of students, apparently, what I can kind of gather by reading between the lines in my conversation with the state, scored about a 1, okay? Or rather not the majority, the plurality, the biggest chunk of students in the state. The student writes about the topic, but the response is so poor and or disjointed, it shows a minimum amount of knowledge about the concept discussed. Okay, so in other words, they write about the topic, but there's only one little thing or one part of the question that they answer, and the rest is just completely broken. Or they have so much trouble following the line of thought that they can't really get any information to really gather the understanding. So, you get a little bit more understanding, but when you're reading the essay, you still don't understand what they're talking about. If we're using the concept of a constructed response on the Roman Empire, you kind of know they're talking about the Roman Empire, and there's one or two terms that kind of catches your eye that was the primary source. But whatever they were writing about, it makes no sense to you. Now, a score of 2 is probably the equivalent of basic, and this is where we get competency. We really want students at 3 or 4, but 2 is where we want the bulk of our students to be at least at. The student writes about the topic and shows some knowledge, but misses some important points or has some flaws. In other words, the writing is kind of there, and you kind of get the gist that, okay, they know a thing or two about the topic, but apart from that, there's still some major flaws. They might say some stuff that's incorrect or not completely answer the question correctly. And so, we're kind of getting to the point of competency, and that's good. And that, like I said, this is where we want the bulk of our students at. We want them to be able, no matter what we throw in front of them, they can show kind of a knowledge of what they're talking about. But what we really want is scores of 3s and 4s. A score of 3, the student writes about the topic and shows competency regarding the concept discussed. Most importantly, this is the difference between a 2 and a 3. The student answers all of the parts of the writing prompt correctly. If the writing prompt asks for 3 things, this writing prompt for a 3 gets all of it, okay? So 3 is not bad. Now, if you noticed what I said, is if they answer everything correctly, they get a 3. And I know what you're asking yourself right now. Okay, so if they do everything they ask, why don't they get 100%? Well, this is why. This is a score of a 4. And this is broadly similar to the old iLeap, if you're an English teacher, for Leap and iLeap, where in order to get a 4 for the writing prompt, they had to show creativity and go above and beyond what was asked of them. So scoring a 4 for social studies on Leap and iLeap requires the exact same thing. The student has to do everything asked in order to answer the question correctly. But on top of it, the student supplies information about the topic or makes a connection that's outside of the sources given. If we're talking about the Roman Empire, you could have a student, like the primary sources are talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, and they say, well, perhaps a lot of this goes back to Julius Caesar, not establishing a proper line of succession whenever he puts Octavian in charge and establishes an imperial whatever. And one of the primary sources was talking about succession issues in the Roman Empire. That kind of insight that goes outside of the primary sources and shows that the student has a wealth of background knowledge to connect to it. And so this is really important. As of right now, less than 5% of students in the state of Louisiana can either answer a primary source-based question correctly with all of the components, much less get this information above and beyond. Okay? So this is what we should really gun for in our classes. We should really work on this last thing right here, getting students to pull information outside of the sources that we remember. And that's what we work on. I do this in my class. After January, all essay questions in my class involving primary sources have to have information from outside the sources, or else you don't get full credit, because I grade my students based on this. Now, if you've seen A Christmas Story, and Ralphie's teacher is like, this thing about his letter about the Red Ryder BB gun's the greatest thing ever. That's the equivalent of a 4. It's just the greatest thing ever. And so this is what you should keep in mind. You want kids to write about like Ralphie in their constructed responses. So the characteristics of poor responses, going back to what are these zeros and ones and twos answers, these are the 5 things that the state of Louisiana says that they saw in student responses this past year. And going back to the report for the previous year, we saw the same things. Number 1, they copied quotes from the source without giving an opinion. I see this in my classroom all the time, and I fight it very hard. Students will take a quote from a primary source, and they see it has to do with the question being asked, but they don't give any opinion. Like I tell the students, these angry old teachers or the grader or me as a teacher grading on the assignment in class do not care that you know how to copy information from the primary source. We want to know what you are thinking, and you need to use the evidence to back up your claims. Speaking of which, the second thing, students make statements without supporting evidence. They don't pull the information from the source. So we have 2 competing things right here that I bet are the 2 biggest ones. That students either put quotes without any personal opinion put to it, or they give personal opinion, they don't back it up. Another thing is students use quotes that don't back up the statement being made. They're talking about Julius Caesar, but the quote is talking about Marcus Aurelius. The 2 things don't match. Using quotes that have nothing to do with the question. The question is asking about changes in emperors in the Roman Empire, and they use a source talking about grain shipments in Egypt during the latter stages of the Roman Empire. It has nothing to do with what's being asked. And finally, going back to this, students use choices from the multiple choice questions previously as an answer to the essay. And this important little tidbit right here, I think is interesting because it tells us that students are struggling to find out information in the primary source. And so they're going other places outside in order to find something that might make sense to get them points with the grader. And I think this last little point is something important for us to go, which tells us that we need to teach students how to analyze primary sources really well. So how do we get students to think like historians? This is a really big thing. How do you get them to think like historians? Because these constructed response tasks, much like the science task gets them to act like a scientist, these assessment tasks require students to act like a historian. This is some of the stuff. I have a history degree. This is what I did when I was doing historical research for the assessment task, reading primary sources, forming opinions based on them, and reporting my findings in a report form. So, whenever we get students to think like historians, it generally requires high order thinking, and a lot of times as the teacher, we're like the dolphin in the back, just kind of pulling everybody along, and you're like, why? I'm the only one doing some work. Making students think like historians really makes a call for us to get interactive. First thing you could do to kind of build up these activities you can use to build up historical thinking skills. For example, give students boxes of items and have them determine what the objects have in common. You could give them boxes to identify who's the historical figure you're talking about and give them clues and make them piece together the clues to figure out the person or event that you're talking about. Make them act like detectives. This connects, science, they do a lot of CSI. Well, you could do some CSI social studies edition to get them to talk about and pull facts from what they know in class in order to figure this out. Okay? And once they connect the dots, have them write an essay giving their findings and talking about the thinking process, which they came to the conclusion as to who you're talking about. Okay, think of it as a treasure hunt, man. Goonies never say die. They always go after the treasure and they don't stop until they get it. Think of this as a treasure hunt for your students to go and dig and find out the answer that you want them to find. Another one, make students play the role of people in history and force them to make decisions in these situations. In my class, we generally play one strategy or role-playing game per month, and I do this for this exact purpose. And one of the tricks I do is students, sometimes in my class, because we do so many thinking exercises, they really work on becoming outside-the-box thinkers. But for history, sometimes I like to show the inevitability of some events. And so what I do in the role-playing game situations is, because I play the game master and everybody in the group is kind of, everybody in the class are in their individual groups playing the game, I tailor the story that we play in order to force the characters to make the same decisions that we're talking about. And when the students say it's no fair and things like that, first off, I'll say the joke and say, I'm the games master, I'm in charge, I can do whatever I want. Ha 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 ha. But on the other hand, it gives me a teachable moment to show the students that a lot of time decisions are made in history because leaders are backed into corners and have no other option. Or the point is, they may have several options, but they end up picking the least terrible option. And so, this goes back to when some younger teachers were kids and we played, Oregon Trail. You simulated you simulated crossing the Great Plains to go settle out west, and you were given decisions that you had to make. These simulations really help out students with historical thinking skills because they get inside the brains of people in history that they're studying. And the third thing, current events. Make students read about current events and think how much of the story the reporter actually knows. One of the things with primary sources is you have to realize that primary sources are only from a limited point of view because it's coming from that eyewitness report. What you could do is you could do a current events article and give several different events from several different sources and let students figure out what the entire picture is. Get them to think. Get them to think about what's going on from different sources. Okay? And then they can create the whole picture from there. Okay, a great website is Newsela, Newsela, that provides Lexile-based news reports on different reading levels about same topics, and you can use that in your class. The final thing, and this is probably the most complicated thing, and this is what I do in my class every year at the end of the year, is make students interview people and create oral history projects. This is where students actually get to, record primary sources and interview people. This is for experienced operators using primary sources, and they write essays based on their findings. In my class, we always do this at the end of the year, is students interview someone who was in our area, since for those of you who don't know, where I'm at is in the Deep South, when schools were desegregated. And I get students to talk to people who were in school around what their age was, 6th, 7th grade, when they were desegregated, and then they compare what school was like and the desegregation social factors to what it was like in school. And the students always come back with a completely different view about desegregation and race relations in the area and how life was completely different not so long ago. And it gives them an appreciation of the whole historical process and the discovery and things like that. And they think it's the most amazing thing ever. And it's always kind of the capstone for the year. That's my kind of goodbye present for them. And they leave my class with a piece of historical research that they did themselves about something in their lives. And I think is really important, which leads students to do things like interviewing Chris Pratt at Parks and Recreation and finding out all sorts of important things about how nice he is. So, create an effective social studies task. Now that you kind of know what you need to do in order to get students to be historical thinkers, know how they're going to be assessed, you have some fun little activities to get them thinking like historians, you want to make them work in the nitty-gritty of working with primary sources. Whenever I say primary sources, I won't lie to you, my students generally groan whenever they hear it. But the thing is, the key to the mastery of social studies content knowledge is primary sources. My students groan and complain because they do it all the time, and I drill it into their heads. But at the same time, whenever they debrief me on their testing, they talk about how actually it was so much easier that they spent the entire year writing, and that while, maybe my students may not have been that 5% who all scored 3s and 4s, I'm pretty sure there were a whole lot of 2s and that they were showing basic knowledge because we spent all year writing, and we do writing workshops 1 day a week in social studies, writing with primary sources. Now, just to review types of primary sources, this is not encyclopedic. We're talking about diaries, journals, letters, autobiographies, government documents, photographs and paintings by eyewitnesses, newspaper, magazine articles from the time of the event, interviews, physical artifacts, maps showing boundary time of events. These are all primary sources that you can use. And especially when you get into fifth and sixth grade, and junior high and into high school, you want to use multiple primary sources for the students to have to work with. Okay, simply put, to quote one of the great thinkers of our time, Indiana Jones, if it belongs in a museum, chances are it's a primary source. Okay, so questions to ask for primary sources. These are some of the things you want to scaffold and get students to understand. You want them to read the primary source, and you want them to answer some of these questions. You want to know who created the source, how close they were to the event. Is the author biased? In other words, are they slanting? Are they making you want to believe one opinion or the other? Or are they just like Joe Friday from Dragnet and just giving you the facts? When was the source made? Sometimes eyewitness accounts immediately or even long are can be inaccurate based on the whatever the point of view, but primary sources and interviews long after the fact can be not very accurate because people have spent time talking with other people and that's colored their memory of events. And how much this whole story does the source tell? For example, in history in college, I wrote a paper on the Battle of Jutland, which was the largest naval battle in World War One. And in terms of primary sources, I might be able to read a letter of a sailor on a battleship from home. But if I wanted a larger primary source view of the event, perhaps I would want to read the diary of one of the admirals or the ship's logs or something like that, because it gives a broader view of the action than one person below deck shoveling coal for hours at a time. You got to keep that in mind. You want students to understand that. In lower elementary, you don't have to be as detailed, and you might want to ask this just to kind of get them thinking. But by sixth grade, you want to be introducing some of these concepts to the students to get them thinking about that, because in high school, this becomes a really big thing. Social studies task activities should cover the big ideas talking about in class. Those big ideas are the topics tested on LEAP and iLeap. If you're kind of confused or you kind of can't think of it, think about this. What are you talking about in your unit or your chapter? And what's the biggest ideas you want students to know, or what's the biggest event that happened? Find primary sources based on that and go from there. If you're teaching on the American Revolution, you might want to talk about Paul Revere's ride or the Battle of Yorktown or something like that. Those are the big events. You don't want them so much to get bogged down in the minutiae of small events, because that's not what LEAP and iLeap are going to ask. Now, you might want to do it as a supplemental activity to show kind of what a common person did, but if you're writing an assessment task for them to write, you want to go that. If you're not quite sure of some questions to ask, in Louisiana, we still have the comprehensive curriculum, which talks about activities and stuff you can use with the course that they kind of greenlight and say you should use. But at the beginning of each unit, they give guiding questions that students should understand, and they're big concepts, and that can be the first step. You can work from there. Social studies tasks should have high-quality sources that are centered on a primary source for students to analyze. Even though sometimes on social studies tasks, they might have secondary sources like magazine articles, encyclopedia articles, websites, and stuff like that, the meat of a historian's work is primary sources, and you can't go wrong with that. We'll discuss where to find them at the conclusion of this screencast. But going back, what I just talked about, what are primary sources? Get those and use those. Sometimes vocabulary tends to be difficult, so you might want to edit them by changing words to reduce the lexile difficulty to get students to understand it. But you don't want to do too much editing, because then it stops becoming a primary source. So you kind of got to be choosy, and you need to really focus on the vocabulary that they can't quite understand and just put in brackets what they were talking about. So it's very important for you to pre-read these sources in order for you to get this information. Once you have your source together, you need to write some scaffolding questions. They should require students to pull information they need for their essay. In other words, you want your scaffolded questions to be kind of comprehension-based to make sure students understand what they're reading, but you want them to be pulling information and writing answers supported by text, which in their English language arts class, they are getting plenty of with Common Core, because that's a major component of Common Core. So you want students to answer questions that are based on evidence. In other words, George Washington crossed the Delaware River. When did he do it? Well, you have the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. And you can say, what do you think were some hardships by the American soldiers? Well, you want the students to say, well, it was very hard because there's ice in the water and they were bound up and stuff like that, and they were attacking the Hessians at Christmas and something, information like that. You want them to quote things from the source because you're really clever in how you scaffold these questions because you want the questions to tie in with the writing prompt. That way they have their opinions and information sitting right there already made, and then they could plug it all in to form a coherent essay. Okay? Writing prompts from the social studies ask should require students to use historical skills to provide evidence from the sources. The question for the writing prompt becomes important here because it's the culminating activity. Students should be challenged to think about the big idea, important concepts that run throughout the topic of study, and the questions they've already worked to write for the essay. The way I write my essay prompts is in order to answer the essay, in order to write the essay, you end up using all of the information from the scaffolded questions with the quotes as backup evidence. So what students end up having to do independently is that they just write an introduction and a conclusion. And the pedagogy behind this, the thought process, the teaching idea behind this is that whenever they go to take the assessment task on LEAP and iLEAP, they're given some primary sources and they're asked to write a essay response with claims. And my idea is that while they don't have the particular questions that they use all year in order to construct it, the students have learned throughout the year, because we discuss it and we reflect on it in class, that those are the kind of questions you ask yourself while reading the primary source. So what happens is they see that my questions link directly to the components of the primary source. So when they see those components, they go ask themselves, how do I know this? And then they go dig in the primary source and they find the information. They do the same thing. So what I end up doing with my primary source activities that my students do every week and they turn in as their constructor response component of their test is they go through the process of reading a source, gathering information through comprehension and gathering evidence, and then piecing it together to form a coherent writing. So grading essays, my students do this and they turn it into me. Grading essays for social studies must follow the same rubric. We cannot expect students to write at the level of 3s and 4s if they're giving them 100% for scores that are frankly a 1 or a 2 if they're given on there. This is so important. The state of Louisiana shows and evidence that 95% of students cannot answer all the parts of a primary source based essay question. Okay? So in other words, in our assessment, 95% of our students should not be getting the correct, 100% correct on their essays unless they are writing the way the rubric asks. And I'll tell you from my own personal experience and my own personal evidence in my class, students generally, I only get about 10% of them whenever I kick in starting in January, I kick in the requirement that you have to pull in information from outside the source. Still, even though I beat my students over the head with this all the time, consistently, every week, this is what you need to be doing, at most 15 to 20% of my students on a particularly easy essay will get all their points. I'm telling you that now. So even in my class, even with me doing as much of this, I still have a whole lot of work to do, and I'm still trying to fight students with this, to get them into the minds of the historian. I'm not saying that this is easy, but I'm saying that this is what we need to work on. If you're kind of stuck, take the information from these slides and take it from the notes, the screen notes that I have on here, and use it as your rubric. Say, hey, a score of 0 has nothing. And I will give students zeros because students will write about things I have no clue what they're talking about. And I'll say it's completely irrelevant, give them a 0. They might be upset, but then whenever I talk to them and show them what they wrote had nothing to do with what I asked, they're still upset, but the lesson is learned and their essays tend to improve. So where do they find these primary sources? I can hear you right now. Lauren, okay, so this is really important. I need to do this. But, you can't, I don't even know where to start. Well, this is where we need to look online. First off, the Library of Congress has DocsTeach. This is right here where you can find ready-to-use activities and documents through the National Archives in order to find information. So this is the first one, which is docsteach.org. You can get the information right here. The next one I have is the University of Houston's digital history. The sources I'm showing right now are mainly for 3rd through 5th grade American history. And you can pull timeline, documents, even textbooks, teaching resources on the United States history. And it goes all the way to the modern era. Okay, they can find landmark documents, court cases. You can pull information and things like that. Okay, and that's from the University of History's website, digitalhistory.uh.edu. And the Library of Congress's digital collections, you have a whole lot of information. You can pull library standards, bibliographies, you can pull information, you can talk with the Library of Congress and even get activities to go from there. Moving into world history, you have Eyewitness to History right here, which gives a whole lot of primary sources. That's really interesting, and it's what I use in order to build my primary sources. I use this one pretty often, but you can actually use it for United States history as well. At the university level, University of San Diego has a guide to online primary sources that has all the information used: ethnic studies, government law, U.S. history, world history, medieval history, military history, ancient history, the sciences, all kinds of things like that. And if I go, for example, to world history, and if I'm wanting to learn about Islamic history, you can pull up these websites right here and pull up information in order to write, get primary sources in order for students to write. The final one I have right here is the Internet History Sourcebook. It says Ancient, Medieval, and Modern History. This is more for worldwide history. I use it a lot in my 6th grade world history class. The Ancient and Modern History, as you can see, we can pull up information like on Mesopotamia, and I can pull up the Code of Hammurabi right here, and it's got all of the information, the actual primary source that's been written right here, and I can just go all the way through it, and I can pull out the information and use this. So this is Paul Halsall's Internet History Sourcebook. Now, this is by no means a completely and totally encyclopedic reference for primary sources. You can go online, you can look for primary sources all over the place and get the information from there and build it for. I've spent plenty of nights building my primary sources by just surfing the web and reading through primary sources and finding which one best connects to what I've been teaching in class and which one best helps the students conform, create a coherent essay. So that's it for the presentation. I really hope that I've given you, information. You can go forth like Harry Potter and go forth and be an awesome wizard and show students historical facts and information like that. And in our professional development from here, we swapped lessons and information what we did. But at the conclusion of this, I'd like to tell you that if you check on the notes for the video right here, I do have a link to my source book that I kind of wrote. It's about 5 pages. It's kind of everything I've talked about, including the objectives, and also includes all the links that I posted right here. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Drop by in the comments or anything like that. And as always, thanks for watching.